Hey friends, welcome back. Today I did a small experiment that turned into a full 12 hours of discovery. I picked up a sheet of handcrafted rice paper with tea leaves still embedded in the surface. It kind of looks like someone pressed a piece of nature just straight into the paper. It's got tiny fibers, threads of plant material, and it looks incredibly delicate, almost translucent. At first glance, you think it would disintegrate if you look at it too hard because it's so very thin. But I was curious about how it would react to my gouache kit, so I rolled with it. Before we jump in though, some quick housekeeping. If you like these kinds of studio experiments and in-depth explorations, please like the video and subscribe for more. And if you want the extra behind-the-scenes footage and early access and a sprawling Discord community one click away, go ahead and check out my Patreon. Some tiers even feature exclusive merch and goodies 4 times per year. So let's get into it. Welcome back to another Butcher Shop. Experimenting is the heartbeat of creative growth. We don't learn if we don't try. And we don't discover if we don't go out looking for something new. So in today's video, I really just want to emphasize how important it is to sometimes just break free from your regular patterns. Let's break up the idea of experimentation into 3 distinct and practical categories that you can use as a framework: medium, material, and technique. Each one pulls on different strings of your practice, and when you play with them intentionally, you'd be surprised by the possible outcomes. Firstly, let's talk about the medium. And by medium, I mean the overall materials you use to create. So these could be oils or acrylics, gouache, watercolor, anything, even digital platforms. Switching your medium is like learning a new dialect of a language you already speak. It wakes up different muscles, challenges you to make different decisions, and forces you to practice different kinds of patience. When you move from digital to real paint, you'll encounter resistances that teach you about edges and opacity and the weight of pigment. And when you move from watercolor to gouache, for example, the opacity of the paint changes how you reserve highlights and how you think about layering. Each medium comes with a set of pros and cons that subtly reshape the choices you make in composition, value, and gesture. Secondly, we can experiment with materials. So your material is the surface that you create art on. It's the substrate you choose to work on. Paper is an option. Could be various weights and textures, could be linen or canvas or wood panels, and yes, it could also be unusual things like handmade rice paper that still has plant inclusions. Materials carry their own history and their own mechanical behavior. Paper pulls and canvas stretches. Wood resists. The rice paper I use today has some very distinct qualities that pull water along its fibers, which changes how pigment spreads and dries. Selecting a material, therefore, isn't just a trivial choice, it's a statement about how you want your art to behave. Lastly, you can experiment with your technique. Technique is the how you blend, lift or layer or scrape, or otherwise manipulate your paint strokes. Small changes in technique can dramatically alter the final image. If you shift from wet on dry to, for example, wet on wet, the way edges read changes drastically. If you start adding dry brush strokes after a wash dries, you create texture and contrast. So exploring different techniques is often the most subtle and also rewarding experimentation because it can be tested without buying new supplies. You can practice new techniques with familiar materials and still discover a lot. So when experimenting, I recommend being very explicit about what you are changing. So name the variable. Are you going to experiment with your materials or your medium or your technique? Name them. And if you change your material and medium, for example, at the same time, so if you take 2 out of 3, you may discover some very exciting synergies, you know, how your new material and your new medium can work together. Or you might actually drown into your experiment and its complexity. So maybe start with one variable in scope and then expand from there. Create a hypothesis. You know, what do you think is going to be the outcome of this experiment? And then test it and document the outcome. It's pretty much what I'm doing here right now. I tried out this rice paper with gouache just to see what would happen, because I knew that rice paper all by itself would require a lot more water. And what I discovered is that I had to use so much water to make sure it would stick on the paper that my gouache paint almost turned into ink, which is incredible. And it was a lot of fun, and you'll see the result throughout this video. Art is not a sterile laboratory. Art is very much about a disciplined curiosity that helps your practice evolve. Alright, so if you want experiments to feed your growth, you gotta give them a little structure. A useful cycle is plan, test, observe, record, and repeat. Let me talk you through these. So first off, you start with a plan. You decide on one primary variable that you will alter. So for this particular rice paper test, my variable was the material, the tea leaf rice paper. So my medium remained water-based pigment, or in this case gouache, though I did allow my technique to shift flexibly. To do a test, I did a small study, a single sheet, I ripped off a piece of a corner, and I tried some small washes, a few strokes, and I very quickly discovered that rice paper required a lot more water than what I was used to. And it's actually kind of funny because naturally, or like, you know, in base mode, I paint super dry. I think I've recorded a couple more videos where I explained that I use any type of paint as though it's oil paint. I paint incredibly dry. So it actually was kind of fun and a world away from what I normally did to have to add so much water. But yeah, so that was the testing, and the data was obvious. You needed water. And I got that from simply observing. So I looked at what was happening. You know, did the pigment, did it clump together, or did it wash all the way out? Or you can also keep an eye on the texture of the paper. You know, does it add something to it, or does it destroy something? You know, we've all been there when we've added way too much water to a piece of watercolor paper, and you get the little pills, when you get the little clumps of paper fiber that just start rolling up. And it's the first sign to let you know that there is a hole forming in your paper. So observe, what does this do to your medium, or to your technique, or to the materials that you're using? The next one, so recording is not really mandatory. I mean, it's nice, it's cool if you want to look back on it. But recording can be a very wide sense of it. You know, you can just make some notes, you can write them down, or you can, like I did here, film the entire process and then look back to it. Take photographs of different stages in your experiment, etc. So that when you start repeating things, you don't just create happy accidents, you can very specifically pinpoint the things you want to change and the actual things you want to experiment with. So switching mediums trains different parts of your brain, I think. When I moved from a purely digital practice into working with gouache, I really did feel my observational skills sharpen. Digging into paint forced me to sort of pre-visualize value relationships, because gouache responds differently to layering, than how I would work digitally. Working in oils, I've rarely even done that. Like, I've done it a couple of times, but what I remember is that glazing all by itself is, oh boy, it's an interesting technique, but it's also a technique that's required because of the way oil paints work. Rather than thinking of one medium as is superior, so rather than thinking one is better than the other, I try to think of them as different training modes that strengthen the visual mind. Also, the limitations of a medium really push you into inventiveness. For example, the opacity of gouache forces a very careful consideration about where you reserve your highlights. If you, for example, work with watercolors, highlights are just a different type of beast. You gotta sort of think backwards because you want to keep the whites in there, the whites from your paper, because white watercolor doesn't really do much. So it changes the way you think and the way you approach your entire progress, basically. If you switch mediums intentionally, you'll begin to see cross-pollination. Skills you learn in one place carry into the next. Watercolor sensitivity to value helps your digital color choices. Oils glazing discipline improves your layering in gouache. Cross-trained artists gain a broader visual vocabulary, and it's all because people experiment with different things. So let's take a moment to dig into the rice paper itself. Historically, rice paper and mulberry papers have been used for ink and brushwork because the paper amplifies bleeding and because of how the fibers accept pigment in a way that blends beautifully but also retains that visible texture. It really forces you to understand that negative spaces and paper texture are co-authors of a final composition. When I applied my gouache, the rice paper changed the paint's expected behavior. Gouache is normally used in almost solid and opaque layers. However, when combined with the thirsty rice paper and higher water ratios, it behaved more like ink or watercolor, maybe even. It was very thinned, it was pooling in low points, and it was very much feathering along those fiber lines. So the takeaway here is that choosing a material is partly practical, but partly also a narrative of your piece. The paper's history becomes part of the story that you tell, or that you're trying to sell even to a collector, and physically unique papers with those visible inclusions really create a sort of tactile connection that digital reproductions can never fully replicate. So that connection gives you an edge that is both visual and also sort of poetic. In terms of how the material affected my technique, one method that worked really well was to intentionally thin my gouache more than usual and to sort of use it like ink. So thinned gouache keeps its pigment, but it also really gains that fluidity. It was a really cool interaction with that rice paper, and I absolutely loved it. I alternated between white and sort of bleeding out inking, and also very controlled brushing. So that interplay of these opposing gestures produced an effect that felt both ancient, but also sort of contemporary, I guess. So when you let the surface tell you how to change your technique, two things happen. First off, you learn to respect the material's rhythm and textures, and secondly, you also discover new ways to use a medium, because I had no idea that gouache could be watered down this much and still actually work. So yeah, this is really what experimenting is all about, and it's also really why it is so important. I would have never known this had I not just, sat down and tried this out, see how far I'd get. So from this test, I really pulled, a couple of lessons. Most obvious one is to respect the material's agency. It will really reward you. Another one is to not be afraid to push the medium that you're using beyond its expected use. Surprising behaviors are often creative gifts. Next time that I want to work on a piece that has this sort of Asian vibe, I might definitely pick up some rice paper and do the same thing with my gouache paint again, because I just loved how it came out. Another lesson is to document my experiments, and I've been doing that for a long time, of course. This is not the first time-lapse video that I've made, but it's always good to sort of look back at how things worked and how I did certain things. So I am keeping this video for, a study for at some point later. Additionally, this work really reminded me to revisit humility in my studio. Letting materials have a say often softens your perfectionism, and that creates room for wonder. It's so easy to sort of get lost in your perfectionism, like, I want this brush to do exactly what I want it to do, because if this little splotch of paint, it does not look the way I have it in mind, this painting is a failure. That is often the mindset that artists have when they dive into their next piece. But honestly, if you let that go for a bit, and if you allow your material to dictate you what is required, 9 out of 10 times, there will be no problem and things will sort themselves out. So that's a little, that's a little something I just wanted to give you guys. Messy, imperfect choices are often the ones a collector will remember. So if you want to try a similar experiment, here are some practical tips for you. First off, buy a small pack of the paper first. Don't be like me and don't commit to 100 sheets the first time you buy something. Test different water ratios. Start very shallow and then increase the amount of water deliberately so that you really start to understand how your medium responds to changes. Also, it could be very helpful to photograph each individual little test to compare that behavior. What is important if you do that is to use very consistent lighting. Another tip would be to use brushes that you trust. Your old, worn out, round brush often behaves better on fibered surfaces than a brand new synthetic brush. So really stick to the things that you are already comfortable with, because you are already breaking your comfort zone by performing this experiment on itself. So keep the things that are close to your heart, and then build up the experiment outwards from there. Also consider running a pair test. So do the same composition on standard, normal cold press watercolor paper, and then do it on something else. Compare how color saturation edge character and textures differ from each other. Those side-by-side comparisons are often the fastest way to internalize material differences. Creativity truly requires courage. It is a lot easier to stick with the familiar, where results are predictable and processes are repeatable. But experimentation is really training for creative bravery in a way. When you fail with intention and you record what happens, failure ceases to be a setback and it becomes a sort of curriculum. It teaches you constraints and opportunities at the same time. Sustaining experiments is another form of courage, in a way. Don't treat them like a moment, treat them like something that builds up your portfolio. They are ways to explore your styles and the techniques that you are comfortable working with. Ultimately, these experiments are letters to your future self. They record your curiosity and your willingness to try something. So for me, this rice paper experiment really reminded me that materials arrive with stories and that a cooperative relationship between hand and substrate often makes better art than brute force and control. And trust me, I am normally someone who really enjoys that control. So I was really surprised that I enjoyed the freedom and the bleeding effect of the very watery colors on the paper so much. So honestly, if anything, this video is really an invitation to curiosity. That curiosity, disciplined by simple methods, expands your artistic toolbox in ways you'll be very grateful for later. In any case, thank you so much for sticking around through this bit longer exploration and experimentation. If you found this video useful, consider supporting the channel either by giving it a like or commenting down below what you thought of it. Or you can also directly support me on Patreon, where I post more behind the scenes footage. You'll get early access. There's a very cool and growing Discord community, but you'll also get exclusive merch a couple of times per year. So yeah, consider it. In any case, again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, do buy that weird paper, and do mix more water than comfort tells you to. Listen to the surface. Keep experimenting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.